Hi, I'm Bill Crystal. Welcome to Conversations. I'm pleased today to be joined by University of Chicago law professor Will Baude, very distinguished, young but distinguished law professor at that fine law school at the University of Chicago, well known for his work on constitutional liquidation, a very interesting topic. And Madison, I guess that's a phrase from Madison, is that right? I think
Yeah.
so. Yeah, which we should have a separate discussion on. And also, maybe more notoriously, seems to have invented the phrase "the shadow docket," which Justice Alito got upset about recently. But maybe about the way it's been used, not of course about your important scholarly work on it. But anyway, Will clerked for Chief Justice Roberts and is a leading commentator on many matters of constitutional law and federal courts. But what we're going to talk about today is provoked by a recent piece you wrote, but also by other, just by the facts of this, by the moment, which is the whole question of the elections and election overturning and threats to democratic elections in this country. Will, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
And I would say I would not have expected to have this conversation. I've been in Washington a long time, and I've been through transitions of one party losing. I was actually in a White House where we lost after one term, in the George H.W. Bush White House, and one always knew that the system we have for transferring power or for ratifying election results and certifying them and then moving forward to let the new party take power was a little unusual, sort of an accretion of different historical and constitutional and legal, procedures. But I got to say, I never thought a moment about it in all the years I've been here. I went through one where I remember being with Vice President Quayle in January of 1993, and him, getting saying, I guess I have to preside now and certify that we lost and that, Bill Clinton will become president. And we joked a little bit about not the greatest day of your vice presidency, but of course he went out and did it. None of us thought a thing about what was happening. Occasionally there'd be one rogue elector. And then it turns out we have a system that, I'll let you explain what the system we have and the institutions and laws we have, but maybe we should take a minute to talk about what happened. I mean, in your view, what was the sort of just the highlights of this very unusual transition we had from November 3rd to January 20th?
Yeah, well, so the most unusual thing about it was that it was, there were a lot of points where it wasn't totally clear it was going to happen. We have these hardwired dates that turned out to be immovable, like Election Day and Inauguration Day. But between November 30th and January 20th, as you said, a bunch of stuff's supposed to happen. The Electoral College has to meet, their slates have to be certified, then their stuff eventually gets to Congress, it's supposed to count it, it's supposed to, affirm who it is. And at each stage of the game, there were efforts, sometimes spurred on directly by President Trump, sometimes by sort of other people in the orbit, to try to throw something in the gears and see if they could stop it from happening.
So and before we get to maybe going through the different aspects, the different places where things have to happen and could have gone wrong at state level, the executive branch, Congress, the courts. In general, just sort of top line summary, how alarming is the whole thing to you now that it's more or less over?
Yeah, I mean, it's alarming. I guess I'd say it's alarming. I don't want to be an alarmist. I don't want to say we almost had a coup in this country. There were still a lot of things that would have had to happen to go from, senators and representatives objecting to storming the Capitol to get a full on constitutional crisis or coup. So I think we still had plenty of safeguards between us and that, but we blew through a lot more of the safeguards than I think people came to expect. And, I think the whole process is sort of like, I guess most people think about it the way I think about my car. Just sort of, there's a lot of stuff going on under the hood. I never really worry about it. It seems to work. Every once in a while there's something a little funny and you take care of it. But you don't really think about how many moving parts there are and sort of how miraculous it is that it usually just works just fine.
Yeah, that's a good analogy, I think. I mean, I was involved just in a few things gaming out the situation before November 3rd because we should remind people it wasn't that this was a total surprise. I mean, President Trump highlighted, or what's the word I'm looking for, foreshadowed that he might likely challenge election results if they were close and if he had been ahead on election night, and then would have these mysterious dumps of votes from the mail-in ballots and so forth. But I got to say, we didn't quite see. We saw some of the stuff that could be done,
Yeah.
pressure at the state level, but not everything.
Yeah, so I had a friend, who people may remember in the first day after the election results came in, it was sort of too soon to tell for sure who won because several states were still close enough and votes were still coming in. And then, a few days later, most of the news media decided that Joe Biden had won just enough states to put him over the top. And I remember I had a friend who said, "Okay, so is it over? Are we done worrying about what's going to happen?" And I said, "Well, this is good. I'm less worried than I was before." But there are still a bunch of things that have to happen. The Electoral College has to meet, and I'll be a little less worried after they do that successfully. And then Congress has to meet, and I'll be less worried after that happens successfully. And then, January 20th, Joe Biden is going to stand on a stage and take the oath of office, and then I'll be less worried once each of those things happen. And at each of those stages, I guess there was some reason to be worried.
Yeah, and I think a little more rickety than we sort of expected. Rickety's not quite fair, but more pressure points that were where there were norms and expectations, but not quite the kind of maybe legal scaffolding one thought was there.
Right. I mean, in a lot of these, we grew this process obviously from the Constitution going back several hundred years. So some of the mechanics, were originally there for good reasons. You couldn't just move information across the country at instant speed. You had to spend a lot more time worrying about, is this the real copy? Am I got a forgery? Who are these people? So the system is kind of built. I mean, it is literally built for a horse and buggy time when you had to imagine how are we going to have the whole country make an immensely important decision and make sure that we're all confident that went well. Now that we can all watch it on the internet in real time, it takes on a different meaning.
I also think, don't you think, we'll get to the actual institutions and sort of the nuts and bolts of the discussion in a minute, but I think people were, I'd say for me, I shouldn't speak for anyone else, maybe a little complacent, weirdly, because of 2000 and even 2016. So in 2000, we had a election in which the popular vote and the electoral college vote differed, and we had the decisive states decided by an insanely tiny margin of whatever it was, 537 votes. And it was messy, and there was a lot of bitterness and contention, including at the court itself, I suppose, in the final decision. But it got resolved, and it wasn't ultimately, for all the talk about it, it was going to be an overhang and all this. There's some legislation to. A couple of little things were fixed, maybe, but basically we chugged along, and then we had normal, so to speak, elections in 04 and 08 and 12. And then in 16, we had another electoral college popular vote divergence, though not close enough to really call into question the results, I suppose. And in fact, Hillary Clinton conceded, I think it was the afternoon after Election Day. And, there's grumbling, God knows, about what about the popular vote and all this, and a tiny bit of efforts, maybe the Electoral College should decide differently than the popular vote. But again, the Obama administration cooperated with the incoming Trump administration, and not much drama. And I guess one thought, gee, we've been through those two. At least I thought, the system, for all of its, as I say, sort of historical accidents that had accreted and so forth, seemed to be okay. And I don't know if that was more generally a view. Do you have the sense that people were?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think people, again, on the other side, there were people who were lobbying the Electoral College in 2016 to, make an independent judgment that Donald Trump would be bad for the country and just not let it happen. And, they took the message that, okay, we just don't do that. And, probably good that we don't do that in the end. And so, yeah, I think a lot of people thought that's, ultimately there's some responsible adult somewhere in the system who makes sure this whole thing works. And I think even, I guess we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. I think there are even people who were involved in some of these shenanigans who probably knew better, but who probably thought, well, eventually the courts will make sure that the right thing happens, or eventually somebody else is in charge of making sure that this all works. And I guess one of the sort of takeaway lessons is that there's no one person who we can just count on to make sure everything works fine. So we shouldn't all just assume we can misbehave however we want and blow off steam, and it'll mean nothing.
No, that's a very good, actually, point. And I would say, don't you think that also just no one had quite expected a president to be engaged systematically and from laying the groundwork pretty systematically. I mean, he wasn't the most systematic person, but laying the groundwork from weeks and months ahead of time, and then doing various things at the state level and the federal level to try to disrupt the system. It's one thing for some grumbling on the outside, but I think one shouldn't. I think we'll get more into sort of institutional and legal questions, but one probably shouldn't leave aside the fact that that's kind of a key fact, but once it's been done once, one can't count on it not being done again, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I will say, so in 2000, we did have both candidates not conceding, or
Right.
or conceding taking it back. But for weeks, we had two candidates both claiming they should be president. So it's not like we knew, oh, somebody's going to stand down the
Well, I
first
wouldn't
week.
say. Don't you think two candidates both claiming that there should be more of a process to count the votes accurately,
Yeah. Right. I
but
mean,
not
right.
quite claiming. I would say that's in fact, I think, an important distinction. Not quite claiming that they should be president, claiming that the votes, when fully counted, would justify perhaps a claim that they should be president.
No, that's true. That's true. So even when Al Gore was resisting the 2000 election, even though it wasn't, I'm sure I won, and if we just dig around long enough, we'll find the 5,000 votes I need to win. It was, right. We haven't had a full process, but I think, of course, if he had the recount, he saw it and he lost, he would have accepted that, or vice versa. That's true. And I think, but this is something we should have been aware of. Is one of Donald Trump's greatest skills has been sort of intuitively finding these weak points in people and in institutions and kind of poking at them, and getting them to misbehave. So maybe it shouldn't have been a surprise, but I was still a little surprised.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think it was, and going forward, I think that once it's been done once, it's more likely to be done a second time, which is right. I mean,
Yeah,
we can't anymore say, well, that would never happen.
yeah. Look, if in 2024 we have another close election where both candidates behave themselves consistent with the rule of law and nobody tries anything, then I'll sleep a little easier. But for the next few years, I'm not sleeping as well as I used to.
So let's talk about then the particular, I don't know what you'd call them, pressure points, inflection
Yeah.
points, where institutional hinge points where one can, which our system depends on. I guess the states is maybe would be to begin with, since we do have a federal system, and
Yeah.
we got 50 different results, and would turn out to be, well, in this case, I think counted pretty accurately. It seems in almost every state, but it turns out there's stuff that can happen between November 3rd and whenever the the state electors assemble to ratify the results.
Yeah, so exactly. So there's a couple weeks, more than a month, I guess, between Election Day on November 3rd, which the Constitution calls the time of choosing electors, and then the day the Electoral College sort of meets, so to speak. They don't all meet in one place. They collect in their individual states to cast their votes. The Constitution calls it the day on which they shall give their votes. So during that 6-week period, that's the time to try to lobby electors to be faithless. If you can do that, that was the 2016 thing. But that's also the time that there's some ambiguity about whether states can do more. So, the Constitution never explicitly says that electoral votes in the states have to be done by popular vote. That's just become the custom, but it wasn't always done that way. And textually, states can do other things. So one of the first sets of pressure points was, if you're a red state legislature and your electorate has just given a narrow victory to Joseph Biden, can you take it back? Can you pass a law saying, well, ultimately, we, the state legislature, are in charge, so we've decided actually not to honor the results of the November election, but instead to pick the Republican slate? And that's a legal ambiguity. I happen to think they can't do that. That once election day has happened, that's actually the time the electors are chosen, and by then it's too late for the states to take it back. But the statutes Congress has passed have little exceptions in them, like if the election failed to happen, for instance, then the state's allowed to, as a backup, pick somebody. And that was envisioning, there'd be a snowstorm or somehow nobody could get to the polls. But if a state said, well, the election failed to happen because, we think there was widespread fraud or something, then maybe the states could do something.
And maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think almost all the states had passed legislation saying they should ratify the popular vote, right? It wasn't that it was a blank slate exactly. They had to overturn that in a sense after November 3rd.
Right. They would have had to convene, pass a new law, repealing that and putting in place an
Right.
electoral slate. But constitutionally, I guess there's a little
right.
bit of it. There was an opening for them to do that. Now, luckily, no actual state did that. There were members of various state legislatures who said we should do this, and even a couple who claimed that if they did, that they'd like privately talk to their caucus and they thought the votes were there to do it. But this was one of the first. Had that gone differently, had Pennsylvania and had a couple states gone with that and said we're going to pass a new law, rescinding the election and declaring our electoral votes to go to Donald Trump, we would have been in a much worse constitutional crisis.
And I suppose there was in some states, and it really does differ now state by state. Here, state by state, I think, in an intermediate stage where there were election commissioners whom none of us had ever, or I shouldn't say for you, I had never heard of, and individually or even collectively. And it turns out in Michigan on November 20-something, they meet, and there's 5 of them, and they sort of have to do their own MIDI certification that the results are accurate. And that's that was a point before you might get to the state legislature.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So there's sort of almost a stream from the votes come in, the votes get counted, the votes get certified, various legal questions that affect some of the votes have to be determined by mid-level election officials. This is part of the whole machinery between the casting of the votes and the electoral college saying, okay, here's what we've voted, has room for exactly low-level officials, state legislators. It's interesting. I hate doing this kind of doomsday counterfactual scenarios, but I guess, to be responsible, we have to a little bit. If you imagine somebody who was better organized and had a lot more people in the party really behind them, then, you might have known where the pressure points were much, much better. I don't think the president was organized about this, but if you'd, carefully put in place the right election commissioners in Wayne County and wherever else, it might not have taken that many people to swing enough votes to swing enough states.
Yeah, no, that's a going forward question, which we should get to in a minute. If you have a political party that is now thinking about doing things that I think it's fair to say no political party in modern times really has quite systematically about, well, how would you go forward in a forward-looking way, going about put the right people in power? What are the implications of that? Maybe we should just talk about that for a minute now. Isn't that pretty striking that you do have the Republican Party sort of thinking, again, not very systematically, but certainly in some states, people running almost explicitly on the I'm not going to be a wimp like those election commissioners in Georgia or either state level commissioners or county level executives in Michigan and so forth.
Yeah, no, I think it's terrifying that one important way to be in good standing in the Republican Party and to rise to prominence in the Republican Party is, I guess, the big lie is to say, I believe Donald Trump won the election, and that Republicans who failed to, take his side, failed to find a way to keep him in office, are betrayed him, and I'll be a true party loyalist. I think it used to mean that being a party loyalist meant you did everything you could to win the election for your candidate, even when your candidate was flawed. If the new test of being a party loyalist is that you do everything you can to keep your candidate in power, even when they've lost the election, then we've lost the plot.
That's really a good point, a good formulation, I think. And it is, it's one thing for people after November 3rd to suddenly, a few people decide, hey, we could do this. But then there are these norms and customs that sort of helped some people push back. And if you've been elected on that platform, it's a very different thing. That's where I think the big lie, I think a lot of the people, and I'm one of them, who've complained endlessly about how can you have a party that's legitimating the big lie and how much damage that does. But the damage is often put in this slightly abstract way of, it's bad for the country to have people propagating lies, especially about important things like elections and democracy. That's certainly true, I would say.
Yeah.
But it doesn't quite get to the concrete character of what you're saying here, that if you have a party that's electing people based on that, it has a real implication for what might happen in, I guess, conceivably some elections in 2022, but certainly in 2024.
Yeah. Maybe it won't matter. Maybe it'll be overblown. But I'm suddenly a lot more worried about it.
What else at the state level? The courts were involved, state and federal.
Yeah, so then in each of these sort of internal disputes, you have, questions about the votes being cast, you have officials taking action. Then some of those disputes have to go to the state courts, who have to decide who's right and wrong about them. And then, worse, also the federal courts have some role in kind of policing what's going on in the state courts. Another one of these lingering legal issues, which is actually a legal issue left over from Bush versus Gore, is about the sort of the internal separation of powers in the state. So the Constitution says that the state legislatures are in charge of the rules for presidential elections. But of course, in practice, you have executive election officials and courts involved, the way they always are in the administration of the law. And so this is another constitutional ambiguity: is does that phrase that the state legislatures are in charge mean that state courts have less power than they usually would, or that state executive officials have less power than they usually would? And so you had a serious effort to get the federal courts involved, to say the state court ruled this, but the real meaning of our statute is that, and therefore, even though our state courts have resolved the challenge this way, the federal courts should get involved and resolve the challenge the other way. You had several Supreme Court justices, skipping out to the federal courts, say, that's a real issue. We should probably get into that at some point. They didn't choose this election as the time to get into it, but that just adds another round, another layer of kind of opportunity in terms of manipulating the different institutions of the state. Because if you lose in the state courts, now you suddenly have an additional out to say, well, maybe the state courts shouldn't really be the ones to resolve it.
And one has the impression I have that almost every case was resolved in favor of the state officials resisting last-minute efforts to overturn things in 2020.
Yes.
But how certain is that as a pattern going forward in terms of,
that's one of the things I'm least worried about is the federal courts, or even the state courts being sort of active mischief makers in this process. The courts have had a series of doctrines for a long time that basically amount to, it's really hard to convince the courts to change the results in the middle of the game, and even harder to get them to agree to change the results after the fact. Basically, courts don't ever order new elections in this country. They do that in some other countries, but they just basically never do that. Now, people often on the left have complained about that in various situations, because that can mean that voting rights get abridged and nothing happens. But it does mean that the courts are the least likely to be receptive, I think. Now, the courts may not save us, to be clear. Like that means that because the courts leave everything alone, if you can successfully suppress the vote in some county or cause shenanigans to happen, the courts won't necessarily rush in to save it, but they're unlikely to be the ones to rush in and cause trouble.
And how likely are they, though, to be passive if you have a pretty, what I think would be, from my view, and maybe yours, egregious attempt by either election commissioners or partisan election commissioners or partisan state legislature and executive branch to do something that we would regard as kind of overturning the will of the voters? How likely would they be to step in to prevent that, I guess, is the other question.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't hold our breath waiting for the court to step in. I guess we'll get to it in a second. But if the process in the Capitol and the Vice President had gone differently and resulted in Donald Trump being declared president, I'm not sure the Supreme Court would have stopped it.
Really? So even when it's a federal process,
yeah,
where they presumably would feel a little more ability or responsibility to do something.
They might have jurisdiction. They might have some ability to do it, but I'm not sure that would have happened.
So, better to have responsible judges and justices than not. Much better to have them at the state level. It sounds like what you're saying in a way. Well, but the federal district courts played a role too, I suppose, in appellate courts.
Yeah,
but that's not the first line of defense, is what
right. And it is striking. I do think this again. Not enough credit's been given here. A lot of the judges who were not falling for these shenanigans were Republican-appointed judges. A lot of them were appointed by President Trump. I know that when President Trump was filling the bench, there were lots of complaints that he's stocking the bench with his people who are going to eventually do him a favor in turn, and that did not happen. Right, the judges that Donald Trump put on the bench did not show any signs of corruption.
And I think if there had been more of a mixed verdict from the courts, that would have had its own rebound effect on the political system. That is,
yes,
if
exactly.
You could plausibly say, as a Pennsylvania state legislator, well, it's complicated. Some courts were with us, some were against us. We need to resolve this, as opposed to whatever 61 or 62 courts, or I can't remember, was there any 61 or 61 courts had it all gone in the same direction. That would have made a difference politically, I suppose.
I think so too. So take somebody like Mitch McConnell, who for a long time was quiet on the question of who had won the election, and after the Electoral College had met, eventually he was willing to say he recognized Joe Biden as the president-elect. And I think one of the factors in that was that Donald Trump had brought a bunch of court challenges and they'd fizzled out. Because for a while he would say, well, look, he's entitled to bring his challenges, and if the courts agree with him, then, okay, we'll follow the courts. But so once you could say, look, there's no ambiguity here, you just lost over and over and over and over again, that allowed at least some people in the Republican Party to be more secure in saying, we're really not going to do this.
Right. So that first stage, which I guess, let's say in 2020 dates would be what, November 3rd to December 14th, when the Electoral College is really state focused, and almost state, not just focused, but entirely. The federal government, Congress does nothing, right? And the federal government does nothing, and a few federal courts do a little, but it's mostly upholding state courts.
That's right. I mean, of course,
or rejecting
right.
cases as with not, with no standing or whatever, or not.
Right. That's right. For the first part, the federal officials really have very little role. They're the party, of course, since people are members of the party, they may still be taking their cues from what they're hearing in Washington. There was this little wrinkle about the General Services Administration, which can sort of turn over transition funding, and there was a period where they were not turning over transition funding because they were refusing to decide who was president-elect. But for the most part, that first phase, it's still out there in the states. It hasn't yet all come into Washington for us to.
And my impression is that right now, as we speak at early October of 2021, not much has changed in the states, in the sense that there are not new safeguards in major states that would prevent no safeguards that would strengthen the system, so to speak, from a political overturning of elections, nor perhaps the other way either, new anti-safeguards to make it easier. Right? Is that right? We're sort of in the status quo at the state level. I mean,
I think that's my sense, legally anyway. So no state has passed a law saying we reserve the right to overturn the election if we don't like the result, or things like that.
There's been talk about such laws in a couple of states. Yeah.
Personnel-wise, there have been some changes in the actual voting laws. In terms of voter registration, polling times, the more normal partisan chicanery that I think we've been used to for the past couple hundred years. And I think we don't know well enough, are there quiet moves in terms of, who's on the election commission in the right county. But mostly that's about where it was before.
No, I think we should come back to the political party question, which I think remains a big one. It's a more informal, you might say, question than the formal laws, but it's very important, obviously, because if a party is pushing on every weakness, that's very different from a party saying, let's just make sure we don't exploit the weaknesses, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So then you mentioned the executive branch. Maybe we should take a minute on that, because meanwhile, Trump, in this case, is trying to do things at the Justice Department, at the Defense Department, with the General Services Administration, probably less importantly, but, and stuff's happening within the executive branch. And that goes, I guess that culminates more after December 14th, when the state efforts fail, you might say, and you've got the vote count,
right.
And now it's suddenly, how do you try to maintain power given that vote count? And that's partly a Congress, January 6th, Mike Pence side of things, and partly an intra-executive branch side of things. So say a word about, how alarming do you find the intra-executive branch efforts at justice and elsewhere?
Yeah. So the president wanted, as far as we can tell from the reports, he wanted the Department of Justice to declare there was widespread election fraud in various places and start prosecuting people. He wanted the Department of Justice to file briefs on behalf of the United States, saying that the election had been wrong, joining some of the state AGs who were doing this kind of thing. And none of that happened. On the one hand, there were more people in the White House who were trying to make that happen than I would like. I would like to live in a world where everybody, the president says this, and his chief of staff and the White House counsel, everybody talks to us just like, Mr. President, we're not doing that. He had people saying yes, but he had people like Bill Barr, who, again, a lot of people have not been fans of, but people like Bill Barr saying, Mr. President, we're just not going to do that. He had people in the Solicitor General's office, refusing to take his calls or refusing to make it happen. So I think the Department of Justice, I guess, comes out looking pretty good. The Department of Justice comes out, basically unwilling to move on this.
Despite Barr resigning or being fired, which for me was a huge alarm bell. I think people maybe I'd say having been, the craziness of quitting a month early. I mean, whoever does that? I mean, first Esper gets fired, the Secretary of
Yeah.
Defense, a week in after the election, and then the Attorney General, and you start thinking, if this were a foreign country, and there was an interregnum between the election day and the an inauguration day, and the Secretary of Defense and the Attorney General either get fired or quit, you'd kind of be worried that something's going on.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's right, that's right. So I guess that's a little worrisome, but so Trump needed to get the Department of Justice to actually move, to do
Right.
things, and to do that, you can't just fire people. You got to have people willing to do them. There was some, possible theory of installing a new temporary person, which this is another one of these pieces under the hood nobody worries about. As what are the rules for installing acting officials when there are temporary vacancies, and can you use that to get around Senate confirmation and so on? But in the end, he wasn't able to figure out a way to do that. I think in part because of the threat that everybody in the Department of Justice, would resign, which
Yeah.
both practically would mean nothing would happen, and optically, even the president recognized would not be good. So again, I don't mean to sound Pollyanna-ish here. Right, we lost the Attorney General because he refused to go along with a plot to steal the election a month before Inauguration Day. But in the end, his willingness to do that and everybody else's willingness in the department to stay at their desks and keep doing their job meant that that was not the weakest point.
Yeah, I think people underestimated before November 3rd how much Trump's being president as opposed to being a challenger who was contesting an election. I don't know if it really gave well, it certainly gave him an advantage, but it gave him all kinds of leverage to try to pull, mostly, as you say, ineffectually. That, of course, if you're just outside complaining, you don't get to, appoint people to be acting attorney general. You don't get to threaten to fire the CIA or FBI director and so forth, right? Put
Yeah,
loyalists in. So
yeah,
I guess the threat is greater from an incumbent president or party than a challenging party, just in that simple way, right?
yeah. No, for sure. And I think in terms of the right, I mean, the fact that you're already in possession, right? If possession is 9/10 of the law, and for now Donald Trump possesses the White House and the seat of government, that puts him in a much stronger position.
I suppose that's true at the state level too, right? I mean, we talked abstractly, not abstractly, but generally about these states. But it sort of mattered that there were Democratic governors in the key several swing states and other officials, and then actual Republicans elected who wouldn't go along. I mean, the possession is also 9/10 of the law at the state level, and
Yeah,
if you had a very different, I guess you made this point in a way, but just to reinforce it, I mean, if you had different people in office in November of 2024, things could look quite different at the state level.
yeah. No, exactly. And I guess that's as long as there are enough responsible people and enough responsible people, bipartisanship, and so on in the various institutions, then I don't have to worry that much. But of course, over the course of a couple of years, you can't be totally guaranteed that everything's lined up in a way that makes it totally secure.
I mean, it tells me that looking forward, just in the very short, medium term to 2024, the state level is more, assuming that the Biden administration doesn't go the route of the Trump administration and doesn't try to, monkey with election results with Merrick Garland or
Yeah,
whatever. That the worrying more about the state level and a little less about the federal level maybe would be a good idea for people who are worried about election subversion or overturning elections in the short, medium term.
yeah. That's probably right because of course the Republicans possess a bunch of states. They don't possess the White House now. And the other thing is it's just unpredictable, so it makes it harder to plan in both directions. Is, of course, you don't know exactly how many states will be key and which ones they'll be.
Right.
So it only takes a couple of people in the right place to have a big influence. But we didn't know exactly which states and which counties it would be. We don't know now, so that makes it hard to totally sleep easy. You can't necessarily make sure every single county is totally secure. But it also means that if you were plotting a coup in 2024, it's not like you can just put in two or three
Right.
sleeper agents and you've got your plan.
Yeah, it has to be a party-wide effort, which, of course, unfortunately, it sort of is. So that's like the good news and the bad news, right?
We got a few years. We've got a few years.
Right. No, I think that's very important, though, the degree to which the one other point I'd make on this, we're doubling back in a way, but I think it's very important. This is an important topic. This is so much understandable. We'll get to this in a minute. January 6th, the Capitol, but that's in a way maybe not quite as practically important as these as what happens at the state level. But that's a dynamic situation at the state level. That's the other point. I think people sometimes we can take a snapshot in October of 2021 and say, well, this is what Arizona looks like. This is what Pennsylvania looks like. This is the governor. These are the laws. These are the court justices and these court judges in these states, the judges in these states. And this is the mood in these states in terms of willingness to stand up. That may be quite different 3 years from now, though.
Right. I mean, they could be actually different people, and the mood and the national currents and the party currents could be different, for better or worse.
Yeah, right. I think people sort of vaguely assume a reversion to the better because that's been the history, but there's also some suggestion, if you look around at other parts of the world and so forth, that once these things get unleashed, they don't automatically toothpaste doesn't automatically get itself back into the tube, right? I mean,
yeah. Well, and here's look, if you're an ambitious politician and you want, a higher place in the party than you have now, one opportunity you see now is to promise to be an attack dog, and you say, you got to get rid of this guy as the county chairman and replace me because I would have, gone to the mat for Trump, or get rid of this guy as the Secretary of State and replace me because I would have found the 10,000 votes. And you could do that even if you don't believe it, right? You could do that thinking to yourself, of course, I would never really do that. I'm just saying this to, get in power, and one day I'll behave responsibly once I'm in power. I worry that people who behave irresponsibly to get power don't suddenly develop responsibility later. But you could have plenty of people who are doing this, just strategically.
But we do. I mean, I think that's a very important point. It's not as if we haven't, that's something no one's thought of. There are a bunch of people running for office, and Secretary of State of Georgia and Arizona and elsewhere who are explicitly running on on the platform you suggested.
Yeah. And I think some of them may believe it. But I think some of them know better. They know better. They just made a calculation. This is the play.
Yeah, it's funny how much one gets back when you start to talk these things through. To the political party and to the public opinion, and away a little bit from the legal formalities. It just presumably any structure of legal formalities is susceptible to pressure, and laws have to be carried out by human beings, right? So
we are skipping around our institutions, but this is, I guess, the time to say it. So, why was January 20th sort of the magic ultimate date? Is we did have enough sense, there were enough people, that once there was an inauguration in which Joe Biden was sworn in as president, there were enough people who would say, all right, now it's over. But that's just part of the norm, right?
That's really a good point. Yeah.
That's just the one norm that so far nobody has really managed to shake or rattle.
And Trump has tried, some of Trump's maybe more oddball supporters have tried to say that. That's the one part that hasn't quite taken off, I would say. The kind of, we should reinstate him in August or something like that.
Well, Trump didn't just stay in the White House, install some loyalists in the military to guard the door and say, I'm not leaving, right? That was still not on the table. But that's no different than these other norms we've been talking about. It's just that happens to be one that we haven't lost yet.
Yeah, that's a good point. So between December 14th and January 20th was January 6th, and so let's talk about that, both in terms of Congress's action and the vice president's action, as well as the public, what happened in the Capitol, obviously.
Yeah, right. So obviously, in the Capitol, the House and Senate have this somewhat arcane and mostly ceremonial, although with some question marks, role of officially accepting and tallying the electoral votes under the supervision of the vice president. And this was a pressure point back in the election of 1876 that produced a contested election and the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. And after that, Congress passed legislation, tried to make it work more smoothly, and it's mostly worked pretty smoothly. But that turns out to be have multiple areas for pressure. We had objections for an objection to be sustained or sort of entertained to any electoral votes. You have to get a representative and a senator. There were plenty of Republican representatives willing to do it, but there was kind of a hunt for a willing senator, and they found a few. And then you have the vice president presiding over all this with a slightly unclear role. It seems like his job is mostly to be a potted plant and just kind of keep things running. But, once you have the gavel, there are questions about that. And then in the middle of that, we had a storm of people invade the Capitol, having been whipped up into a frenzy. So I was watching this in a little window in the corner of my laptop while it was happening, while I was preparing for con law class. Just kind of like curious what was going on, and then suddenly the screen went dark, and then I go over to Twitter and people are saying they've breached the Capitol. that was certainly one of the moments I was the most worried.
So on the mechanics of January 6th, how important is it, and how doable is it to make that clearer or less susceptible to manipulation? What do you think of the whole Electoral Count Act and the proposals for reform of that?
It's hard to totally fix it. So the Electoral Count Act is an old statute that could be clarified and streamlined in various ways. That probably would be good. But there is this lingering constitutional problem that's not totally clear that that this is something that can be regulated, because there's a whole bunch of arcane stuff in like the 12th Amendment and other parts of the Constitution setting up the process. So one of the outside arguments is that the whole Electoral Count Act is unconstitutional, and the vice president has these inherent constitutional powers. There's not a lot you can do legislatively about that. So I think reforming the Electoral Count Act would be helpful, but probably the more important things are three. So legally, it was important that each House of Congress had enacted rules in which they agreed to sort of use this process for counting votes, not just in statute, but that as a matter of the rules of the House and Senate, they'd agreed to follow them, because that clears up one of the major legal ambiguities of whether a statute can tell a House of Congress what to do. And then, personnel-wise, having senators and a vice president who are just not willing to sit still for this stuff is probably the most important. And we didn't quite have that on the senators. We did have it on the vice president, ultimately. So somebody probably ought to be talking to the vice. Yeah.
Right. And how important was that? I mean, there's been a lot of controversy about Vice President Pence, and some people say, well, I mean, even if he had tried to do something, it couldn't have happened. So it was all kind of just one state or two states that were being challenged. And even then, what would the challenge have amounted to? And it would have all gone away just in a sort of messier way over the next 2 weeks. And other people say, no, it was important that Pence, resolved it.
So first of all, I think Pence, there would have been more room for trouble if Pence had more to work with. This goes back to the states. If 3 Republican state legislatures had, after the election, revoked the state's electoral votes for Biden and given them to the Republicans, and sent that to the Senate, so we actually had dueling slates, the elected slate and the legislative slate, then there would have been a lot more sort of legal ambiguity and discretion for Congress and the vice president to work with. So they had more to work with. That would have been worrisome. And then if that had happened, and if Pence had said, well, I've got 2 slates here, and there's at least a decent argument that the Republican slate is lawful under these various provisions of the Constitution, so I'm going to either certify those or declare that it's undecided, and, that alone wouldn't do it. If the vice president just unilaterally declares a coup, that doesn't happen. But then the question is who else goes along with it. So if he'd said that, and then there'd been a sort of fracas among Congress, and then the majority of the House and Senate had decided to endorse his view, and so now suddenly you had the vice president and Congress taking this side of a kind of questionable decision, then I think there's a real chance other people would have fallen into line. Then there's a real chance that various other officials would have said, well, this is really strange, but we're going to go with it. And then I think there's a real chance the Supreme Court would have said, we're not getting involved in this. So I think that could have kicked it off.
I mean, the storming of the Capitol was terrible, and we should maybe talk about that for a second in terms of sort of the tying together of the intra-governmental, that's the right way to put it, and the extra, sort of the governmental threats is this is a kind of classic way that these things, democracies do begin to fracture or get challenged or get overturned even. But I do think, for me, watching it, it was the vote late that night. It was so kind of swamped in terms of the coverage by the drama of the occupation of the Capitol, the insurrection, that 140, was it, House Republicans or something like that, but certainly a clear majority of the conference voted to at least, what did they exactly vote to do? Not to accept the electors, I guess,
Right.
from one or two states, I think it was,
Right.
Pennsylvania.
Right. On the grounds that there were still various, spurious, but various questions about the validity of various things in the state.
It's unclear what that would mean. Not, I mean, what would it mean if they had had the majority and there had been 218 votes not to accept, or the majority of each state? I don't even know. We're not quite at the majority of each state question. That's the election of the
Right.
selection of the president.
You'd have to have a majority of the House and Senate, so they'd have to. So, but yeah, if you don't have votes to reject the electoral votes, then it would be as if that state had not voted.
I see. So that's the Eastman memo, kind of.
Exactly.
You take Pennsylvania off the board, and
Yeah, and if you get enough down, then you either win a majority of the remaining states or throw the election into the House, depending on the math and the details.
So all the rhetoric about re-voting, that was pure rhetoric. That there was no way for that to happen in the real world.
To have like a new election in the
Yeah.
probably not. I mean, so in 1876 we had the whole electoral count was in sufficient chaos that the result was to appoint a special commission to kind of study it and resolve it and have a compromise. So there's a world that's not totally science fiction in which things are deadlocked and confused. We have a commission, and the commission decides that a special election is the best way to resolve it or something. But
Right.
but not really.
I guess at the congressional, we have had occasional moments where, like in North Carolina, where the election for a particular congressional seat was so corrupted, people thought that they actually had a new election, but we have never done that at the
federal level. And I think we never will of all the. Yeah, and then you of course have the storming of the Capitol, which in some ways, I mean, was the most dramatic and got the most coverage. In some ways, it's not nearly as scary as a lot of the other pieces of this puzzle.
Right.
It seems to have caused some people to sober up and say, "Oh, wait a minute! I guess we were playing with fire. Let's not do this anymore." And obviously now there are prosecutions. I think there were still a couple of places that could have made a huge difference. So, if the storming of the Capitol had just meant that they weren't able to get back in and finish the count and finish the vote late that night, that just puts more time on the board for state legislatures to maybe go back and vote. All the moving pieces are still there. It would give everybody more time to try new things. So I think it was very important and very good that Congress decided, 3:00 in the morning, having been, hiding under our desks, worried we're going to die, we're still going back in and getting this done, so as to cut off any opportunity for funny business. The other, and we were far from this, and so I feel a little bit morbid mentioning it. But if the invasion had been more deadly and more violent, so if there had been weapons on the floor of the Capitol and a lot of members had died, that could obviously make a huge difference because the ability to replace. It's very hard to replace, say, members of the House. You have to have special elections for that. There's a whole set of rules for temporary replacements. And it wouldn't have taken that many people to either destroy a quorum or to really swing the election. And we weren't there with the mob was not nearly that armed or that violent for that to come in, but yeah.
No, that's another issue. That came up more post 9/11, and I know there were people who were trying to change. So that senators can be appointed quickly, I think most states, but House members have to be elected. That's sort of the people's house, right, and all that.
Right.
And so is that a constitutional provision, or is that at least just a norm for 200 plus years? I don't know. But
I think that's it's understood to be a constitutional requirement that you
and
can't have somebody
election.
appointed.
And I remember, people were correctly alarmed after 9/11. If the plane had hit the Capitol, you really literally could have a House of Representatives that wasn't, if they, God forbid, had been there and stuff, that couldn't function because it just would, you can't just reconstitute it right away and stuff. Yeah. So.
And of course, that process would then all have been subject to the same vulnerability. So if we suddenly were reappointing and reelecting 100 new members of the House and Senate, knowing this issue was on the table,
Right.
What would the elections have looked like? Who would have supervised those elections?
And would a president have vacated the White House on January 20th? Would he have had the excuse of, well, let me just stay here until we resolve this,
right?
And these elections aren't taking place till February 15th or March 2nd or something.
I assume we would have moved heaven and earth to have those elections happen by January 19th so that we could have the count by January 20th. But, there's even one last constitutional ambiguity. So it's just unclear. Suppose that again, this is a terrible world, but suppose that the House and Senate is reduced to, like 5 representatives and 1 senator. are they a quorum or not? Like in a way that there's, I mean, this is one of the things people in 9/11 wrestled with, is that there's a plausible argument that that's still a quorum, and so the 6 people are
Yeah,
Congress
right.
until you get more. But there's also a plausible argument it's not. Neither answer is very good because, of course, this could be anybody, and they could like propose constitutional amendments and do all sorts of crazy things. But also to say our country literally can't function until we go back out to the states and get people back in doesn't make a
Yeah.
lot of sense.
Yeah, let's not give people too many ideas about this,
Yeah,
but no, that's a
sorry,
good.
you can edit this
It's a
out.
good caution, though. The vote by the House members. So I see. So you'd need a majority of both houses, and of
Yeah,
course, Republicans didn't control the House, the House of Representatives anyway, so they weren't going to get a majority, and they only got 2/3. Only got 2/3 of their own conference.
yeah,
But again, it's that I guess becomes more of a laying the predicate for future, making that respectable for future actions, than having a situation where a member of the House Republican leadership loses her leadership position, Liz Cheney, explicitly, really, on the issue of whether that vote was correct and
yeah,
appropriate or not.
yeah,
And so there's kind of a ratification of the notion that, hey, yeah, if you guys don't, if there's, and as you say, in this state, they hadn't even gone to the trouble of selecting a slate of alternate
right,
electors based on some
right.
fake, account of a fraudulent election. And even so, they were willing to do it. I think that hasn't gotten enough attention compared to the public, the storming of the Capitol, it seems to me.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I have friends who are remain loyal Republicans, but are now in the I would never vote for Cruz or Hawley or any other senator who didn't know they should have done better. But I don't think that's a widespread conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, an awful lot of senior Republicans have just sort of ducked the issue, or well, maybe it wasn't right. On the other hand, it's not a huge problem. But if you say if people are running on it going forward, and if people start taking a kind of if the whole party moves in that direction, it's a very different story. I'm curious in these informal norms are important, and one was that pretty much every respectable law professor, former judge, former attorney general from either party, to the degree they spoke up, were not on board. Let's just say
Yeah.
the overturning of the election on January 6th. We have the Eastman memo. I mean, where do you think in legal establishment world, including conservative legal establishment and world, has how much of a barrier? How many barriers are there? Can you imagine the Eastman memo or some version of it being
Yeah.
respectable 2 or 3 years from now in a sort of wider swath of the legal world?
Not in this scenario. I mean, but I think so. In this scenario, we were lucky in that all the legal claims were bogus. But if we were in a world where there really were competing slates, and so now we were in ambiguities about the meaning of Election Day under the Constitution, or if we were in a world where there were a majority of Congress and the Vice President disagreeing, so we have the ambiguities with the Electoral Count Act, or where the state legislature versus state court, the Bush versus Gore question was outcome determinative, and many justices and law professors are on the other side of that. And there are plenty of conservative legal scholars who would have, honestly given what they thought was the legal answer, even if that wasn't necessarily going to be good for chaos. So I think we're lucky here in that the legal challenges were sufficiently meritless that people just looking at them on the merits weren't signing on.
And I mean, I haven't spoken with Mike Pence in years, but my sense is that for him, probably the fact that Mike Ludig weighed in, the former judge and Associate Attorney General, whatever his title was, LLC head, I guess, under
Yeah,
President Bush and Bill Barr. That was, I mean, he was such a respected figure, is such a respected figure in
yeah,
conservative Federal Society legal circles. It sort of gave him, Pence, I think, a little more comfort in saying, no, that you can't just do, it's not just a bunch of Larry Tribe, it's not just telling me this,
right.
it's Mike Ludig, right? Don't you think that matters, I think?
No, I think that does matter. But I think Mike Ludig is an honest broker, so I think if the legal challenge was a little stronger, he would have probably felt compelled to admit that.
Yeah.
Maybe he still would have said, "You shouldn't do this," but
Yeah, that's where I am struck by what you're saying. That I mean, that the notion that you can just construct the laws to prevent this, or interpret the Constitution reliably and strongly enough, if I can put it that way, to stop this, is a little dubious. That you do need the spirit of like, hey,
Yeah.
we should not be overturning elections. You know, we
Yeah.
shouldn't be looking for excuses to do so. You can't really ask a law professor to say honestly, if he doesn't believe it honestly, he or she doesn't believe it honestly, that there are no legit possible loopholes or excuses. It's people who
Right.
are guilty don't get convicted of crimes because of genuine legal loopholes, not false ones. But you don't really want a system where people are who seek to exploit the loopholes can do so systematically to overturn an election.
Right. So that's exactly right. So there are loopholes. The loopholes are not as big as the Trump supporters thought they were, and so it turned out to be harder to get anything through the loopholes. But if you spent several years really leaning on them, trying to push something through, I can't tell you that the Constitution is so well constructed that it's impossible to break it open. So if we have a world where half the country is trying to break it open, we're not going to make it.
And it sounds like you're saying also you can't tell me that uh, even if some legislation is passed to make election subversion harder at the federal level or even at the state levels, that
Yeah.
one can be sure that that could really construct enough of
Yeah.
the guardrails couldn't be strengthened enough to sort of work fine no matter how
Right.
hard they're pushed on.
Right, and there are laws that can make the loopholes a little smaller. There are laws that can move a bit of the trouble out of the way. But there's no law and there's no constitutional amendment we could pass to say we never have to worry about this again.
And we just don't have the experience, do we? Have a party that's pretty systematically a part of a party, to be fair, but not a trivial part of a party, and the leader of the party, pretty systematically pushing a narrative, as we say these days, that delegitimizes the guardrails and legitimizes a pretty sustained effort to violate them.
Well, the bad news is we kind of do. So we had redemption after the Civil War,
Yeah.
in which the Jim Crow Party, more or less cheated and murdered and fought its way back into power, and the federal government more or less let them, and it gave us the rise of Jim Crow. It wasn't a nationwide party; it was a regional party. They seized power in only a part of the country, but we did let that happen for a long time. Lots of differences. I'm not at all saying the
No, no,
Republican Party is
it's a good,
but
very good caution. I mean, it would be as if I suppose the ultimate thing would have been after 20 years of Jim Crow that having taken control basically of a whole bunch of state governments and passed laws that they wanted to pass that were contrary to the spirit, if not the letter, of various constitutional amendments and federal
Yeah.
legislation that had been passed. They then had succeeded in putting a Jim Crow candidate in the presidency in
yeah.
1896 or something like that, right? And that
Yeah.
didn't quite happen.
Not quite. Although Woodrow Wilson segregated the federal government, and
No, it's a very good point. I mean, people don't. I myself didn't appreciate. I studied this stuff
Yeah.
a little bit. How fully the reaction, how far the reaction went, and how not inevitable perhaps it was, and how much it wasn't what people expected in 1870.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. So I was there. The fact that it's happened before, and the country's still here, but a lot of bad things can happen.
yeah. What else haven't we talked about that's important, either legally or constitutionally, or more in the spirit of the laws kind of way?
And we were talking about it a little bit, but I guess this is the last question is what to make of all this. So the thing that I would have again slept pretty easy if after January 20th, everybody in the Republican Party especially had said, "Boy, that was a big mistake. We came pretty close to doing something we were really going to regret. Let's impeach Donald Trump, even though it's only symbolic, in recognition of the fact that we're repudiating him and cutting him out of the party and maybe making him unable to run again, maybe not, or even elevate Lynn Cheney to the keep Lynn Cheney in the leadership to say." I guess so. Ideally, I would have been if the Republican Party would say, we repudiate this. That was bad. We wouldn't do that again. Second best would be if the Republican Party would make clear you can still be a leader in good standing in the Republican Party and think we shouldn't have done this. The treatment of Lynn Cheney makes that more nerve-wracking. Although the fact that Mitch McConnell remains in control of his party in the Senate is encouraging. He made no bones about the fact that he did not like what Trump was doing, did not think it was proper, thought it was, he gave some strong speeches. Now, he didn't ultimately join the impeachment effort, didn't ultimately have the votes, so I get that. So the fact that he's still around makes me sleep a little easier. If he's displaced by some other senators, then I'll really get nervous. But as we started with, a lot turns on the states and how things happen on the ground and just where a bunch of people are in the party throughout the country. And I guess that's the question for the next couple of years.
And a lot of that turns on what happens practically in a bunch of primaries and general elections in 2022. I mean, even at the federal level, Mitch McConnell he may still be leader, but he will feel different if in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Arizona, and Georgia, Republicans have won running explicitly on a big lie platform and a "we can't let this happen again" platform, as opposed to Republicans running on something I personally would still find sort of insufficient, but a Mitch McConnell-like,
Right.
Kind of, no, that's not quite right, and maybe there were problems, but we can't just take it law into our own hands, kind of
Right.
attitude, right? I mean,
Right. Yeah. No, that'll be a big difference, and we're not going to kid ourselves. We know that the elections are not going to be won on an anti-Trump, never Trump platform. That's just not going to happen. That's not how things work. But
the Republican primaries aren't going to win on that.
Yeah. Exactly. But yeah, the difference between the "let's do that again but better" and the "let's never talk about that and pretend it didn't happen" would be huge.
No, I think it's a very good note actually to end on, in the sense that you're a law professor and you've studied very carefully the Constitution and the legal structure, and at the end of the day, so much does depend on public opinion more broadly.
Yeah.
And then we have a party structure in this country which is slightly extra constitutional, but of course a very important part of the living Constitution, if we can use that term.
Yeah.
And that a huge amount depends on sort of the overall stance of those two parties, right? And that's more of the Jim Crow point in a way, in this.
Yeah, exactly. No, look, we got the Constitution because ultimately we overthrew the pre-existing legal regime, not not following any constitutional regimes, but just because that's where the people were. Nothing in the Constitution stops that from happening again. We're a long way from that happening, but we, it all turns on public opinion and party opinion and elite opinion and the character of the American people.
Yeah, two last little points on that. I am struck just looking back. We had close elections in this country. 1916, people have forgotten that one. 1960, where arguably, honestly, Kennedy won because of what we might call election fraud in Illinois and Texas. Yeah. Hard to know, of course. And the fact that people just said, okay, we cannot get in the business of messing around with overturning election results, or popular vote, electoral vote distinctions. We probably took that for granted for much too long.
Yeah, or think of, the Nixon impeachment. The fact that once it was clear that the Republican Party was going to abandon him, was ready for him to go, then, he wasn't going to put up a fuss and try to stay. That hadn't happened, that hadn't happened, maybe he would have been able to hang on.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. When he decided not to put the country through an actual, what if he had 35 votes in the Senate? Is that the right math? Yeah, 34 votes in the Senate.
Yeah.
What would it look like to have a president who would sort of been saved
by
pure party loyalty? What's that?
Right. What would it look like to have a president who, by pure party loyalty, survived an impeachment attempt and thus felt emboldened to do what he wanted and recognize that the party was in his pocket? We found out.
Now, that's a very good point. People have forgotten the importance of the failure of the first impeachment attempt by pure party loyalty to Trump. Then what that presumably enabled or encouraged in a bad way and for the next year, and led to the second attempt. And finally, maybe, I guess I'm struck, if you had said to me on January 7th, 10 months ago, that we would be where we are now, not so much legally, though what could have fixed some things, but things haven't gotten much worse, I wouldn't say legally, at most of the states, but we haven't fixed much at the state or federal level. And more importantly, we have a party that's more committed to the big lie than it was, arguably, than it was on January 6th. That part for me is the most worrisome. Maybe it's temporary, maybe it sort of fades, maybe all kinds of other things kick in, and 2 years from now we say, well, that was kind of a crazy little bubble of authoritarian lie legitimating or lie tolerating
Yeah.
moment in our politics, and we're back to semi-normal, but maybe not, right? I mean, that's been a pretty astonishing, I think. It's been an astonishing year, 2021, in that respect.
Yeah. Well, so if I can just make one thing to make it a little scarier, for
Sure, that's,
now,
that's
for now, we've been talking about this in asymmetric terms. We've been talking about this as, of course, the Democrats would never do any of this. They all believe in the rule of law and apple pie
right.
and obeying the law. Uh, it's only so long it can be true that one party refuses to accept the legitimacy of the constitutional system and the other doesn't. And once both parties don't, it's not going to be possible to get anybody in either party to back down. So, if this keeps going on much longer, it's going to get a lot worse.
No, that's a very good point. The what everyone thinks of them, individually, with the Joe Biden, Merrick Garland wing of the Democratic Party may not be in charge forever, right?
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. Yikes. Okay, yeah, we have a genuine constitutional and legal problem, which ultimately is a genuine political problem. I guess
Yeah.
that's the right.
It's ultimately about the character of the American people.
Yeah, that's a very good note to end on. Very rare for law professors to acknowledge that, though, because law professors often are in the business of, if only we construct this particular this legislation, we're fine, right?
Yeah.
But this is where this is very, no, it's genuinely, I'm joking.
I have no illusions about my ability to fix any of this, unfortunately.
No, but that's healthy. I mean, honestly, because there are some things that can be done, however, that would improve rather than make the situation worse. And I do think there is the indirect effect is underrated, the Mike Ludick effect, let's call it,
Yeah.
the legal establishment effect. The on the other side, the Merrick Garland effect, if I don't, without getting into the business of whether every single decision he's made has been correct, as opposed to a different kind of attorney general being appointed by. You can imagine in a different country a party where there's been a genuine attempt, you might say, for the incumbent president of the other party to steal an election. The kind of attorney general who gets appointed by the new president is a very different type of figure than
Indeed.
than Merrick Garland, right?
And there were people pressuring the president to do that.
So it is. It's very foolish to be at all complacent about the moment we're in. Will Baude, thanks very much for joining me today for this very stimulating, if not entirely reassuring, discussion on conversations.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us.